use your great communication skills with people who have so many other distractions 24 hours a day?
I really don't know. You should ask them, because I'm delighted that I have this base, as it were, this following amongst the young. But the only thing I could say in my defense is that old Fleetwood Mac song, you know, don't stop thinking about tomorrow. I've never stopped thinking about tomorrow, and perhaps that comes across in some of the things I say and do. Tomorrow is theirs. I mean, they're the ones who are going to be in positions of authority. What sort of India are we going to leave them behind? So both in my writing and my political work, I'm trying to shape an India that's worth them inheriting.
I've had the pleasure of meeting your mother, and I wonder if you could start off by reflecting on how she shaped your life, your career, and your approach to politics too.
Actually, all of those apply more to my late father, unfortunately. My mother is a wonderful person. I think the most significant quality of hers that I sort of remember growing up is her complete restlessness, and as I called it in one of my dedications of a book to her, her divine discontent. Nothing I ever did was good enough.
Yeah.
And that may, with some kids, work badly and lead to some sort of rebellion, but somehow in my case, it just kept inspired me to keep trying harder and working harder. So to that degree, I will have to admit her most profound impact was on that, the sense that whatever you did, if it wasn't good enough, you needed to try and do better and keep at it. My father, however, was a man very much ahead of his time. He was sort of came from what they call a good family that had fallen on hard times. His own father died when he was 10. He had to walk 8 kilometers to high school barefoot to get himself an education. Was a proud nationalist. At age 12, he led a march in his home village against the British during the Quit India movement. He dropped his caste surname in college out of Mahatma Gandhi and idealism, and then went off to England at the end of the Second World War, thanks to the generosity of an elder brother, to study and make his way in the world, and never saw himself as a migrant. I happened to be born there because he lived there 10 years. But he had always seen himself coming back to India. He happened to be on the advertising side of the newspaper business. So he was the London manager of the Statesman newspaper, and his principal concern was getting British companies that had operations in India to get ads from them for the Statesman and so on. And he was waiting for some Englishman to retire because all the India-based managers were Englishmen. And when the Englishman who was manager of the Bombay office retired, my dad applied, came over. And so I grew up in India from about 2.5 after being born there. And at the same time, imbibed my essential attributes and values, I would say, for me. He was very liberal, and that stayed with me, including on personal choices that are quite astonishing for someone of his generation in the Indian context to make. Because I have people of my generation who have not been so kind to their children. I was inconveniently good at taking examinations. So I kept coming first in subjects that I didn't particularly care about. And when we had to stream in high school, for example, and you had to choose between science and humanities, and I opted for humanities, my teachers were so upset that they actually summoned my father to school and said, "This is our best science student, why won't he take science?" And my father, who like every middle-class Indian parent wanted me to become a doctor or an engineer, was horrified and said, "Why won't you do that?" And I said, "Because it doesn't interest me." And he said, "But you're first in class in science." And I said, "I'm first in class in pretty much everything, but the fact is that you asked me the day after the exam and I'll have forgotten whatever I wrote. Whereas you ask me about literature or history and I'll tell you more than I've studied for the exam and more than the school has taught me." That's the level of interest I have. And he respected that and let me take my own stream. And the same thing happened on a couple of other occasions later in life. So those are the kinds of values I tried to pass on in my own parenting. At the same time, he was somebody who was quite driven, hardworking, a bit of a type A, and I've got some of that too, I guess. And he's also the one, as a kid I know this will amuse you today, but as a kid I was a bit of an introvert. I was the kind of guy who'd go for, social evenings with my parents with a book in my hand and sit in a corner and read. And he's the one who sort of really forced me into a certain level of extroversion, pushed me into debates and speech contests as a young person. Initially wrote my speeches for me when I was 8 years old.
Really?
Absolutely. And then, in some ways, it was his drive that I think took me in the directions in which I've gone since, both as a public speaker and somebody who cared about the ideas and issues that should matter in India.
And in terms of the literary influences on your life at that stage and later on, you're an author in both fiction and non-fiction, but can you tell the audience something about the formative few books that you read that really made an impression on you?
Well, I started writing because I was an asthmatic kid, so I actually was confined to bed a lot, unable to breathe, and those are the days before inhalers had been invented and so on. So you took some very strong pills to dilate your bronchoids, and they opened up your lungs enough for you to breathe. You couldn't sleep, your heart was racing away at 2,000 beats a minute, and you were essentially confined to both being awake and in bed and unable to go out and play with your friends. And so all I had were books, right? So books for my escape, books for my entertainment, and books for my education. There was no TV in India in those days. There was no Nintendo or handheld games or mobile phones or computers or the internet. There were only books. And so everything I did was centered around books from a very young age, and I did read early and read a lot. Again, inconveniently so, because if my parents took me to a library, the chances were that I would finish the book in the car on the way home in Bombay traffic. So then what could I do? So I started writing very derivatively,
right,
along the lines of what I was reading. So I read all these Enid Blyton, Famous Five and Secret Seven and so on. So I invented the Sikh solvers, who were Indian kids having adventures very much like the English kids in her books. Those were never good enough to be published anywhere, but my father got the stories typed up and circulated to friends,
really?
So that I could begin to believe in myself as a writer. And it was he, of course, who did the first submissions of my work, and a sort of World War II novella inspired very much by the Biggles books, where you had so I had an Anglo-Indian fighter pilot called Reginald Bellows, who went off and saved the world in the Second World War. And this was serialized in a magazine called The Junior Statesman, starting a week before my 11th birthday.
Right.
And as you know, there's nothing more addictive than seeing your name in print for the first time. You really do.
What age were you then?
Beg your pardon?
What age were you then?
Just before 11. So I turned 11 a week after the first installment of this appeared. I'd already had one short story in a Bombay newspaper. So fiction was my instinct. That's what I read as a child, and that's what I started writing. As I kept writing, kept being published, I sort of also did a bit of campus journalism for reputable Indian publications. By the time I left India to go to graduate school in the States, which was in fact at the age of 19, I had probably appeared in every single English language publication then available in India, including Eve's Weekly and Chandamama. And a lot of it was short stories, but an even larger amount was just all sorts of campus journalism and off-campus journalism that editors would ask me to write. And indeed, I'm rather proud of the fact that those days there was a rather prestigious award which many of today's big names had competed for in those days. I don't think the award exists anymore, called the Rajika Kripalani Young Journalist Award, which was given to the best Indian journalist under 30. And in my first year away in America, I was startled to discover that I had won that. And so my father went off and collected it for me, and I felt he deserved it.
So you collected it in absentia for you?
Yeah.
Great, great. I note that you've got a contribution in a forthcoming book, Notes from the Hinterland. Now, this is a book which brings together, with a focus on India's small towns and villages, which have inspired its finest writing. I've not seen the book, but I'm interested to know about your contribution to that volume. And
I'm embarrassed to say I didn't even know I had a contribution to that book, and who's the editor. And
it's your name is listed as an Aleph or author in that. But should we move on then?
We'll have to move on, because I think what's happening is that a lot of my stuff is now being anthologized in various places.
Yeah.
And sometimes if someone like Aleph, who in any case is my publisher, can be presumed to have the right to do it. I don't really go into much detail. But now that you've told me, I will look out for this book.
Yeah, I recommend
what
it.
I've done on it. But the Hinterland deserves to be noticed and written about, particularly in English.
Yeah, I quite agree. You're commonly described as sort of lazy journalistic shorthand as a Renaissance man. I'm interested to know which era from Indian history would you compare with that great cultural and intellectual efflorescence in Europe? Where would you like to have trod the halls in previous years in Indian cultural life?
That's an interesting question, because the answer clearly is not the present, where in any case, I don't know about Renaissance man, because I probably, all the politicians think I'm an intellectual, all the intellectuals think I'm a politician, so I'm not sure that I actually win out in either world. But the truth is that there were great eras, obviously the famous 9 jewels of Akbar's court, who included the brilliant poet and warrior Birbal, who was also the object of many wonderfully amusing stories, or conceivably the Indian nationalist movement. The last generation that won us our independence, and most of them survived on to the first years after, were giants. I mean, there were just so many people who in any era would be considered to be exceptional in all sorts of ways. I mean, if you read Nehru's work, and I know that you're going to think, oh, a congressman would say that. Actually, I started off as much more of a critic of Nehru's. When I wrote the biography of him in 2003, I read everything he had to say and everything he'd written. And I was just awestruck by the man's mind. Some of the finest political prose in the English language in the 20th century was written by Jawaharlal Nehru in prison. And it's something that I think we've allowed ourselves to forget here. There's just some extraordinary talent out there whom we only know in very limited context and as part of very narrow political agendas.
Okay, and moving on from that, again, as a person that loves visiting this country and interested in it, publishing books on India from overseas, why do you think Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru's legacies are under such direct and unflinching attack at the moment? I mean, we British, I think we now hold our hands up about our shameful colonial past, but we're genuinely mystified by the treatment of Gandhi and Nehru today. And is this not squandering one of this country's greatest assets in terms of its soft power and its cultural legacy?
Absolutely, but it's because those who've come to power now have come from a very different political tradition. See, in the nationalist movement, there was one big split everyone knows about, the split that led to partition. And that split was not about ideology, it wasn't Marxist versus capitalist, it wasn't about geography, it wasn't northerners versus southerners, it was about one simple question alone. Should religion be the determinant of nationhood? Now those on the Muslim side who believe that created Pakistan. That was the idea of Pakistan. And the vast majority on the Indian side, the very, very vast majority, led by Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru, and many other followers, said no, religion does not determine our identity, does not determine our nationhood. We have fought for the freedom of everyone. We'll create a country for everyone. And they wrote a constitution that embodied that. Now, who in what remained of India rejected that constitution? It was the Hindutva movement, which, starting from Savarkar's first definition of it back in 1922, where he said Hindutva was, as you know, a Hindu was somebody for whom India was his Pitra Bhumi, the land of his ancestors, and his Punya Bhumi, his holy land. So, by that definition, Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains filled both categories, but Muslims and Christians did not. Nor did Jews and Parsis, but Jews and Parsis were considered to be welcome guests, model minorities, whatever. But Muslims and Christians did not. And the Hindutva movement explicitly rejected the constitution. In my book, Why I'm a Hindu, I've quoted at length in their own words the writings of Savarkar, of M.S. Golwalkar, who was the longest-serving Sarsang Chalak of the RSS from 1940 to 1973, and of the man whom Mr. Modi has hailed as his ideological mentor and hero, Deen Dayal Upadhyay, who was Secretary General and later President, briefly, of the Bharatiya Jan Sangh, the forerunner of the BJP. And these were the folks who actually agreed with the Muslim idea that religion should determine nationhood. Except for them, it was a different religion that should determine nationhood. So in the sort of historical canon, the first advocate of the two-nation theory was actually V.D. Savarkar as the head of the Hindu Mahasabha, who called upon India to recognize Hindus and Muslims as two separate nations 3 years before the Pakistan Muslim League passed the Pakistan Resolution in Lahore in 1940. Now, I give you this background just to say that when you ask why is this demonization happening, it's because they actually said this constitution should be torn up and thrown away. They gave two objections to it. The first, that it was created by Anglophile lawyers, full of imported ideas and written in the wrong language, English, all of which was true, and therefore the only answer one could give is, so what? If you can get good ideas from anywhere, why shouldn't good ideas, as the old epics say, fly to us from all directions? But then the second objection was the more far-reaching one. They said, listen, the flaw with this constitution is it assumes that the nation of India is a territory, and the constitution is written for all the people on this territory. Wrong, they say. A nation is not a territory, it's a people, and the people of India are the Hindu people only. So that was the argument that they advanced. And obviously, there could be nothing more different than the vision of Gandhiji, who was a deep and profoundly believing Hindu, but who was influenced by the ethics and values and teachings of every other faith, who had prayer meetings every morning, but as part of his bhajans would have Christian hymns, would have verses from the Quran, would have verses from the Granth Sahib, would have pretty much every religion that was available in the area where he was having his prayer meeting would have a chance to express their voice. This was the kind of India that Gandhiji stood for, and as we all know, he gave his life in the end on the altar of Hindu-Muslim unity. He was killed by a former member of the RSS who believed passionately that Gandhiji was putting Muslim interests ahead of Hindu interests, which makes Gandhiji the first significant martyr to the Hindu-Muslim divide that the British had so assiduously cultivated for 100 years. And I would argue that what happened after that was that because these guys grew steadily in appeal from about 2 or 3% around the time of independence in terms of popular support to becoming more and more a significant party, from 2 seats in 1984 in the Lok Sabha, as you know, to 80-odd seats in the next election, then to 116 seats, then to 182, at which point they formed a coalition government headed by Mr. Vajpayee, and finally to the 2 absolute majorities of Mr. Modi. Now, Mr. Modi, and indeed all of his top echelon, come from the RSS tradition, where they are taught all that was wrong about Gandhiji's writing. For example, Golwalkar would say, what is all this talk about ahimsa? Every Hindu god is shown with weapons. So Gandhiji was even fundamentally wrong about the value of non-violence, according to Golwalkar. And these are the kinds of texts and teachings that have been absolutely inculcated in the minds of those who now rule us. No wonder then that Mahatma Gandhi has been reduced to his glasses. I mean, his ideas, his values, his principles, his life have completely been tossed aside. But his glasses, because of the brand value of the Gandhi name, are the symbol of the Swachh Bharat campaign. That's what's happening today.
Thank you for that remarkably well-rounded answer to the question.
If you're hinting that I took too long, I apologize.
Not at all. Not at all. Also, as a foreigner, as I said, who's very passionate about India, I'm also quite baffled often when I'm talking to Indians from different parts of the country, and that includes the sort of metropolitan elites, how ignorant they are about other Indians in different parts of the country, be it the south, the northeast, or what have you. Is this something you think that ought to be addressed? I mean, it's a very big country, communications are pretty good, but there's still a great deal of misplaced sentiment about other Indians. And do you ever worry that there may one day lead them to split apart in some respect?
Well, I must say for the first time I'm beginning to get worried. Now, before any of you panic, let me explain why. I would say the first 70 years of India's independence was a story of greater integration. In every respect, greater familiarity with each other, with each other's foods. I mean, masala dosas are now as easily available in street food as chole bhature in the north, and indeed puris and aloo bhaji are easily available in the south, and so on and so forth. Golgappas under different names can be eaten in every corner of the country. Some would call them puchkas, some would call them pani puri, some would call them golgappas, but the integration. And every time there's a cricket match, India has never been more integrated, right? So we're all nationalists for 3 hours or 7 hours or 5 days, whichever format we're watching. But, for the first time we're seeing a politics. You know, I used to say, and some of you may have even heard me say this, the thing about India is in a large, diverse country, a democracy like ours, you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. But for the first time, we have a government that doesn't believe in the same ground rules. We have actually functioned within a certain set of assumptions about India, about the nature of India, about our country, about the equality of the people of every religious affiliation in this land, and so on. And all those assumptions are for the first time not shared by those in office and in government. And the frightening thing about that is that they are axiomatic beliefs for many of us. So if you look at, for example, a lot of what the BJP is winning votes on in the north, it's losing them votes in the south. So the same sort of bigotry, intolerance of Muslims, negative readings of history, even rewritings of history, all of that simply does not only not resonate in the south, it actually causes offense in the south in places where our sense of our history is not the same as theirs. So many of the BJP leaders manifest a historical chip on their shoulder about Muslim injustices and depredations as they see it over the years. And for example, coming from my state of Kerala, Islam came peacefully in the lifetime of the Prophet through traders and travelers who had been trading and traveling for 1,000 years before the Prophet Muhammad was born. And so when the new news came from there, it actually interested people. One of the Kerala kings, Cheraman Perumal, actually said, this sounds interesting, I want to go meet this guy. So he actually got on a ship and sailed off to the Arabian Peninsula with his retinue in order to meet the Prophet. He actually did. He didn't, in fact, survive to come back, but the evidence of his visit still stands in the shape of coconut trees from Kerala growing on the Oman Peninsula. It's not native to that peninsula. So that's the kind of history we have by and large in the south. A Tamil Muslim and a Tamil Christian would feel they're far more in common with a Tamil Hindu than a Tamil Hindu would with, let's say, a Hindu from the north necessarily, because of cultural issues, historical experiences, language, cuisine, dress, and so on. Now in India, up to now, we have celebrated these differences. We've said, this is great, this is what we're all about. Let's enjoy the fact that we manage diversity so much better than other countries that are not even as diverse as we are. But today, for the first time, there are social divisions being promoted by the government. And those social divisions are going to, unfortunately, have a political connotation when a constitutional amendment that freezes political representation at the level of the 1971 census expires in 2026. Ironically, this amendment brought in by Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi, was renewed by Mr. Vajpayee's government without debate unanimously in the parliament for another 25 years. So it will be 50 years. But why did Mrs. Gandhi bring this in? Her principal motive was actually that she didn't want to reward those states that were failing to control their populations. So that was her motive. But why Mr. Vajpayee renewed it was for national unity. He knew that having a coalition government in the north with some southern partners and so on, that the last thing you want to do was to politically disenfranchise the south. The present government and present leadership has no such scruples. They have already told the Finance Commission to move away from the 71 census to the 2011 census, and by the time the next time to renew this constitutional amendment comes up, you'll have the 2021 census, in which some southern states will actually lose population. Kerala will become the first state in the Indian Union to have a lower population than the previous census at the next census. And many of the other southern states are growing at below 1%, whereas northern India, and particularly the Hindi heartland states, have been going at 2.2, 2.6, 2.8%. So the result is going to be that about 40 Lok Sabha seats from the south will disappear and be reborn in the north. Now you can imagine what political consequence that's going to have. On the one hand, you have this different sensibility coming from the government. On the other hand, you have the real danger that your voice will not be relevant in parliament because there are too few of you. You tell me how people are likely to react. I worry. I'm a passionate advocate of Indian unity. My own life has been spent throughout India. Apart from being born in London, I went to school in Bombay, high school in Calcutta, college in Delhi, and my parents were from Kerala. So I have roots everywhere and batchmates and classmates everywhere in the country. I mean, India's nationhood, India's unity is fundamental to who I am. But I worry about it now because you've got people who are so completely oblivious that there is an India beyond what they know. There is an India beyond the history they remember. There is an India beyond the politics that they succeed on. And this India, I mean, I can tell you that this India is not going to accept the continuation of this. If a North Indian, Hindutva-inclined, bigoted majority manages to perpetuate the political control and political longevity of this lot, I really do worry about the future of India. And creative constitutional solutions will have to be found to save this country. And it's also a cultural thing. I mean, I'll give you one example. In Kerala, our biggest festival is called Onam. I don't know how many of you know about Onam. Onam is a celebration which every community participates equally. It's like our Christmas and Diwali combined. It is the biggest thing that happens in Kerala. Everyone wears new clothes, gives gifts to their friends, has big feasts, Onam Sadhya, and so on. And no one considers it a Hindu festival. Hindus, Muslims, Christians equally celebrate it. But what does Onam commemorate? Its origins are in a Hindu legend, and that is the story of Mahabali, who was such a good king and became so popular that the Devas began to worry. And Mahabali decided that his own ambitions, were also getting somewhat larger than he could perhaps contain within his own kingdom. So there was a real worry on the part of the Devas that Mahabali would even perhaps intrude on their space in the heavens. So they send an incarnation of Vishnu, Vamana, as a dwarf. And Vamana comes to Mahabali, who's always known as a very kind, just, and generous king, and says, "May I ask you for a boon?" And this gigantic king sees his little dwarf and says, "Of course, what do you want?" And he says, "I just want some land." He says, "Certainly, I'll give you some land. What do you want?" He says, "Just as much as 3 steps. He said, "But you're a small chap, 3 steps won't be very much land." And Vamana says, "That's all I want." And what does Mahabali do? He says, "Okay, your wish is granted." And he's a man who famously keeps his word. And of course, then Vamana turns into Vishnu. With his first step, he embraces the entire world. With the second step, he embraces the heavens. And then he turns to Mahabali and says, "Where do I put my third step?" And Mahabali, realizing that he's in the presence of Vishnu, bows his head and says, "On my head." And so Vishnu puts his foot on Mahabali's head and drives him into the netherworld. But before going, he asks Mahabali for one boon. Mahabali says, "Look, I've been a good king to my people. Allow me to come back every year to visit them and see how they're doing and make sure they're prosperous." So Vishnu grants him that wish. Mahabali is then pushed into the netherworld. The Devas win this. But every year, Mahabali comes back to make sure that his people are prosperous and happy and living in equality and grace. And that is Onam. So Onam we celebrate very much like a sort of secular Christmas for a Westerner, as an occasion for joy and celebrating prosperity and happiness. What does Mr. Amit Shah of the BJP do 2-3 years ago? The eve of Onam, the day before Onam, as a good North Indian who likes to commemorate every important Hindu festival, he tweets, "Happy Vamana Puja." Can you imagine? Vamana is the man whose unjust action led to the loss of this greatest, most popular king in Kerala. And we are celebrating him when he returns for one day of the year. And the BJP is saying, Happy Vamana Puja. You get the irony of it. That's how their vision differs from the vision of the people of Kerala. And it's one example of why the BJP is not winning any seats.
I don't know if the audience is aware, you may have seen on social media or TV that Shashi recently put a toe in the form of stand-up comedy. But I'm immediately going to disappoint you because I'm not going to ask him to do some stand-up comedy.
Sit down tragedy.
Sit down. That's just a lead in to ask him, is there still a place in the Lok Sabha and other political arenas of debate in this country for good-natured political humour? Because it's said in Westminster that Labour and Conservative politicians can knock blocks off each other in the chamber and then go for a beer or a cup of tea, and many are close friends outside the chamber. Is the consensual side of political engagement in this country still a thing?
It used to be. It used to be people had good friendships, even blood relationships or marital relationships across the political divide. Today, it's much, much less true. There's
Really?
a bitterness to the partisan edge of politics today, which I think is most unfortunate, and particularly amongst the two principal parties. There's a level of unpleasantness that makes true friendship very, very difficult indeed. Some of the smaller parties still can reach out to each other across political lines, but we are seeing a situation in which, while civility might be maintained by some, there is now a sort of Manichaean element. Everything is black or white. If I say anything even reasonably appreciative of something the government has done, immediately the stories are, Tharoor is going to join the BJP. I mean, because the assumption is he can't possibly sit where he is and see any merit in anything these guys are doing. Today, I don't see any merit in what they're doing, but there was a time when I still had hope, as some of you did, and it became almost impossible to express that. And I think the frustrations with that become manifest to any of you who follows our political discourse regularly, because regularly you will see in our media, time after time after time, examples of unnecessarily vitriolic abuse, of a sort of take no prisoners attitude to the other side when this lot is in power. We've just seen the finance minister spend 105 days in jail without a conviction of any sort.
Chidambaram.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's something going wrong, I think, with the extent of our political estrangement from each other.
So you're
that
saying
is not healthy for our democracy.
You're saying it's been poisoned in some ways. Why?
Absolutely. The wells have been poisoned.
Okay.
And we're all drinking from that toxic water.
Okay. Your last...
I thought you were going to ask about political humor, actually, because when you began by...
Coming back to that. Your last few books have all been non-fiction, and I happen to know that your next two or three are also non-fiction. Have you lost the zest for fiction writing, given that you talked about it so eloquently earlier, or is it just that life doesn't permit the time to write fiction?
It's not just time. Time is the scarcest commodity I've got, and I must say that being a Lok Sabha MP, some of my more prolific writer friends are Rajya Sabha MPs, and they don't have to worry about constituents pouring at their door at 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. for that matter, or calling at midnight with demands that have to be addressed. The truth is that as a Lok Sabha MP, my time is principally at the disposal of my constituents and my party, and that does create severe limitations of time. But with fiction, what's more difficult is not just time, it's that you need to create a space inside your head to create an alternative universe. A universe whose dialogues, characters, events, incidents, and so on are as real to you while you're immersed in that universe as anything that you're actually living or experiencing in your daily life. Now that becomes very difficult because you create, if I can borrow my friend Amitav Ghosh's words, a glass palace, a palace of illusion, if you like, in which you can inhabit at least for a few hours a day to maintain that continuity. But when you're in a profession which can interrupt that regularly and often does, and drags you off to other kinds of things.
Let alone the media interrupting you.
And let alone the media interrupting me. The result is that you too often come back and find cracks in that palace, or the glass palace altogether shattered, because you can't keep returning to a world of make-believe in which you have not been living for some time. Whereas with non-fiction, what you can do is to actually go back to what you began to write. You may have been interrupted, not be able to touch it for 6-7 weeks, but by just reading what you're writing, the train of thought, the logical argument, because it's after all your own mind that's at work, will come in rather than your imagination at work that needs to be sustained. So I have several sort of half-begun or even more than half-begun novels that I have abandoned on my laptops or my desktop, rather than actually books that ever saw the light of day. My last novel was 2001, Riot, and since then it's been nothing but non-fiction. I think one day it's quite possible that the voters will return me to the world of literature, and then I'll have a chance.
When you're perforce, you'll be back to writing fiction. Okay. So Shashi, you are unquestionably a major celebrity in this country and globally too, and a highly charismatic individual.
Thank you.
You're also, of course, a politician. Could you reflect on the nexus in this country between celebrity and politics?
Actually, in all fairness, I think most politicians, and the country is full of very hardworking politicians, aren't celebrities. They don't get the sort of recognition they deserve, except in their own immediate circles, or their own constituencies, or their own areas, and so on. I mean, is that right? Would you all agree with me? I mean, many of you would not recognize your local MP, perhaps. And certainly there was a time when, not that long ago, when in fact the election posters didn't even carry the pictures of the candidate. But the fact is that now you are looking at an India which is more personalized in its politics, so individuals do get a chance to make their mark and shine up. I would argue, however, what's curious about this phenomenon is that ours, unlike the American system, is not supposed to be about individuals. It's supposed to be about parties. It's a parliamentary system. You're essentially supposed to be asking for votes, not for the person you are, but the kind of ideals, principles, and policies you represent and can implement if all the others like you in your party get elected. Now, I happen not to like that system. I much prefer a directly elected president, city mayor, chief minister, who will be accountable to the people as an individual, because I believe human beings are fundamentally individuals, and it's the individual we ought to judge. But that isn't the system we've got. We've got the parliamentary system. And in that situation, you could well argue there really is no room for celebrities. It's all about who sells the party agenda most plausibly.
So you've led a remarkably full and interesting life, and now we know that you don't have time to write fiction. So when are we going to get the full Tharoor autobiography?
Michael, a few publishers have come knocking on my door, and I've always told them that, listen, I don't think I've accomplished enough to write an autobiography. I need to put a few more things under my belt before I feel it's worth writing. I admit there are interesting things about my life that are worth telling, and once in a while I regale people with anecdotes, but I don't actually write them up very much. And the big danger is, of course, that as you get too old, you might actually forget some of the more interesting things you've done. So at some point I will be tempted, but not yet.
And no chance, borrowing from something I heard Sanjay Roy say to you earlier, no chance of Shashi Tharoor slowing down, retiring?
No, I think what Sanjay very kindly was saying is don't attend too many other literary festivals. Come to Jaipur, but slow down elsewhere.
Slow down elsewhere. Okay.
No, the truth is that Jaipur was the first. I wrote a column in the Times of India, I think, or the Hindu, sometime in the first 5 or 6 years of the century, lamenting the fact that there were no literary festivals in India and talking about the ones around the world that I attended and what fun it is for the audience, for readers, for writers to get to know each other, to create a sort of community of writers. So I'd written about that. And then within about 3 years after that, JLF came into being. I missed the first one, but I came for the second JLF, and I think there were about 150 people sitting in chairs on this front lawn, and that was the best turnout they'd had. It really was a different era. But now, the country has witnessed a proliferation of literary festivals. Almost every second town has a literary festival, and the problem is most of them are in January. So I have been hurtling around a bit too much this month, and that's what Sanjay was referring to. But it's in some ways a good thing, because if literary festivals become a way of keeping books and reading alive in an era when there are so many other distractions, then I think something worthwhile is accomplished through them.
And going back to the earlier comment, which elicited a big audience response on your stand-up comedy, Is there room still for humour in political life in India?
The short answer is no, which is why, when I did this stand-up comedy thing, a lot of my staff were extremely nervous. There's a thin line between being courageous and being foolhardy. And the big worry is whether I might trip over the line and fall on the wrong side. I think I got away with it. But generally speaking, my experience about humor in politics is in India, it doesn't work. I mean, many of you are familiar with the big mishap I had in my first few months as a politician in this country when the government declared an austerity drive, and a journalist who turned out to be later a pro-BJP journalist wrote to me on Twitter saying, "So, Mr. Minister, does this mean you will travel cattle class?" And I having come from 30 years odd abroad, where cattle class is a routine term, is not meant to insult anybody, is meant to insult the airlines for herding us all in like cattle. I replied, thinking that since he used the phrase and I knew the phrase that everyone knew it, I replied, "Yes, I'll travel in cattle class out of solidarity with all our holy cows." But thank you, I'm glad somebody found it funny. The vast majority of India did not. I got on a plane and went off on an official visit to Africa. I was minister in the External Affairs Ministry at the time. And the dung hit the fan here. I mean, literally. It was front page news for 3 days saying that I had demeaned and insulted economy class passengers. Every sort of socialist politician in my party stood up and demanded my head. The chief minister of this state asked for me to resign. I mean, the whole thing was just, now, of course, I mean, the whole thing got diffused when the prime minister, no less, told a gaggle of journalists, for God's sake, it was only a joke. And that somehow pricked the balloon, and that was the end of that. But for 3 or 4 days, this dominated coverage, and I realized the wisdom of Shakespeare's old line, going back, 400 plus, 500 years now, when he said that the success of a jest lies not in the tongue of the teller, but in the ear of the hearer. What a wise line that was, and I knew it and I should have remembered it, because essentially it is not what you intended to say and with whatever sincerity you said it, it's what people think they heard that matters. And that's so true in politics, because in politics, nothing matters but what people think. And what people think in this case is that I'm a jerk who compared all economy class travelers to cattle, which I did not and never intended to. But that was the example. And then the second problem in India, of course, is multilingualism. Cattle class may have been a familiar expression in English, and certainly in the West it was. But once you've rendered it into Hindi and Malayalam and Bangla and Gujarati, boy, you're done for. I mean, so after that, to this day, as you'll see, if you just go on my social media timelines, there'll be somebody flinging that at me day after day after day. They haven't understood what I was trying to do, but it wasn't, obviously, the price I paid for it wasn't worth the success of a joke.
Far too high. And also, the audience might not be aware that Shashi is putting together a book of, I think, your 200 most mellifluous phrases in the English language.
No, I'm not. What I'm doing is, the Hindustan Times talked me into doing a sort of word of the week, which was actually a lighthearted thing I thought I'd toss off, simply because in a curious sort of way, I never thought that there was anything particularly unusual. I mean, I learned my English in India, for God's sake. I went to English medium schools and colleges here. Half the words I use, I've been using as a debater since Stephen's College. I mean, the fact is, these were words that were not that bizarre or uncommon in those days, and we rather prided ourselves on mastering some quote-unquote obscure or difficult words, because in undergraduate life you want to sound clever, and sometimes the words stick in your head and sometimes they don't. But here it became a bit of a joke.
That's unquestionably one of your great calling cards, isn't it, too?
It's become sort of a brand thing, now, which I had never expected it to be. So I thought, why not? Because it wouldn't be a bad idea to just talk about words in a more interesting way than a dictionary would. So, talk about anecdotes relating to the words, their context, their use, their origin, and so on. And that kind of caught on. I did wonder how long the thing would last, but we're heading up almost to a year's worth of columns. And meanwhile, a number of different publishers came up asking if I could make a book on words. And the first one to come was Penguin, who said, somebody had cracked a joke about whether I was writing a Tharoorosaurus, which of course is meant to be a play on thesaurus, but also sounded like a terrifying dinosaur. So, and there I am, the terrifying dinosaur of Indian politics. But anyway, so I finally succumbed, and so we'll be putting a number of these words of the week, along with suitable illustrations, light-hearted illustrations, into a volume sometime in the first half of this year.
Well, I'm sure we all look forward to that.
Well, it's the kind of book that people should keep in their bathroom and dip into once in a while, you know. Might be a good cure for you-know-what. But anyway.
Right, on that note, I'm going to throw the floor open to Q&A. So this is a plea and instruction. We don't want monologues. We want a question, succinct, short. So what I'll probably do is take 2 or 3 questions and we can group them. So there's a gentleman there in the blue top and a lady to his right with your left hand raised.
Hello, sir. Did you finally have your Caesar salad?
That was really a joke. It wasn't meant to be a serious story. But anyway.
Anyway, my question to you is, you have been very vocal about the stark differences between Hindutva and Hinduism. And, but don't you think that Hindutva is sort of derived from Hinduism itself? And my second question is...
just one question, please.
Oh, all right, sorry. Yeah, just the Hindutva and Hinduism.
Yeah, so the answer very simply is Hinduism is a religion, Hindutva is a political ideology. In fact, it subsumes religion. Savarkar actually said Hindutva is much more than Hinduism. He was not himself a very religious man. You should read some of the stuff he's written sarcastically about the cow and so on. So he didn't want to be confined to the Hindu religion as he understood it. He said it's a political doctrine. Frankly, it was written in the 20s when very similar ideals and ideas were being developed and expressed in many European countries. Ideas of ethnic pride, of race purity, of the assertion of the dominance of the Aryans in Germany, and there was demonizing Jews, in India it became demonizing Muslims. But the idea was very much this very old-fashioned ethno-nationalist identity where pride was associated with an attribute of birth rather than of the kind of person you were or are. So that idea has been discredited everywhere in the world. It's gone. I mean, in Europe, there is practically nobody who will admit to being a believer in these kinds of things, except that today, a small revival is happening in America and a big revival has happened in India of an ideology discredited by the 1940s, which had its heyday in those 20 years. So to my mind, Hinduism, and that's why I've written a couple of books trying to describe the religion, is actually very different from Hindutva. In fact, I consider the Hindutva ideology to be anti-Hindu, because what Hinduism preaches, the idea, I mean, you should read Swami Vivekananda. Then for those of you who are more comfortable in English, he's the one major authority on Hinduism who actually preached and wrote and spoke in English. So you're reading the original. You don't have to worry about whether the translations from Sanskrit are off or not. And he basically said, you know, like many rivers flow, some straight, some crooked, down different mountains to the same sea, so also all ways of reaching out to God are the same. They reach the same divine presence. That idea, or the idea that Hinduism, as he put it, teaches the world not just tolerance, but acceptance. We accept all ways of worship as true. We accept all religions as true. So we are saying, for example, to our Muslim brothers, you believe you have the truth, I believe I have the truth. I will respect your truth, please respect my truth. And that's the best basis for coexistence in a country like that. So that's the Hindu way, and what you've got instead is the Hindutva way, which is like the chauvinism of the British football hooligan. You know, my team is the only team to support, and if you're supporting the other team, I'll bash you on the head with my placard. That kind of thing is not Hinduism, but that's what these guys sadly practice.
Yeah, the lady in the grey top there.
Good afternoon, sir. My question is not a political question. My question would be for Shashi Tharoor, the writer. You just said that you would write your autobiography once you achieve a lot of goals that you have. So does Shashi Tharoor, the writer, have any goals that he still has to achieve?
Yeah, I really want to go back to fiction. I'm serious. I mean, there are a few books I still need to write. including books that a lot of my recent writing has been impelled by a certain moral urgency about the trends in our country, and that hasn't fully played itself out. The Tharoorosaurus is just a side distraction, but there are some serious books I want to write. But after that, I definitely would like to go back to fiction because, I was just joking in another session that there's a commercial from the 1980s for a well-known brand of beer that says it was the beer that reaches parts that other beers don't reach. And the truth about fiction is fiction reaches parts that non-fiction doesn't reach. Non-fiction reaches your mind, gives you a fact, a detail, a description, an argument. Fiction touches you in your heart, touches you in feelings and emotions, touches your soul. So one needs to get to that too.
The lady with the white top.
Sir, you'd actually talked about, vote bank politics, wherein once you'd said that every 5 years the government changes and all they're bothered about is the next elections. So what do you think is the model that India could follow for some kind of progress to happen?
It's very, very difficult. I mean, I've advocated now in writing for more than 25 years that we should switch to a system of directly elected executives. I think a lot of what we blame democracy for, we should actually blame inefficiency for. I mean, even a non-democracy like China, for example, gives a town mayor so much authority that a business person can say, I want to make this product in your town. That guy has the right to say yes, grant him the license, grant him the land, grant him the electricity connection, the water connection, the sewage connection, the access to his port or railway station or whatever outlet he has, and even the labor. But that's China, it's a communist country. But that means that it's very easy for a businessman to come and do that in China, whereas in India, the mayor is nothing but the glorified chairman of a municipal corporation. All of his members are equally powerless. That every decision will have to be made by committees of various people, and the purse strings will finally be controlled by an unelected bureaucrat, the municipal commissioner. Now, that kind of thing is pure inefficient. We have organized our system in such a way that there are multiple opportunities for people to be corrupt, and there's no locus of responsibility or authority to deliver results. So I introduced a bill in Parliament that would call for direct election of town mayors and village panchayat heads, and the idea would be you give them a fixed term. They are not dependent on a legislative majority, because as you know, in our system, if you lose your majority over something in your house, you're out of office. That would no longer be the case. You'd have a real budget, which many of these mayors don't have at the moment, and you'd have the authority to spend it, and then be accountable to the voters yourself. So that seems to me a better way of ensuring results. Because that person knows ultimately that he can't blame anyone else or the system, or that responsibility and blame is not so diffused in the end that nothing gets done and everyone lives with it, which is what's going on too much in our country.
Thank you very much. There's a lady 3/4 of the way down near the middle aisle. Her left arm is raised, black top, or is it a gentleman? There she is, yeah.
It's a lady.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Tharoor. I would like to ask you is that since you've already spoken about your autobiography,
He asked about it. I haven't thought about it yet.
Well, I would like to ask you personally, if you were to write your autobiography anytime soon, which I hope you would, what would the title of your book be?
If I had to write it now, it'll be to be continued. So let me not write it just yet. I know in some ways, I once joked, so I may as well repeat it, that I would probably have to call it The Man with Two Horoscopes, because I was born in London and a horoscope was promptly made, and the information about my birth was sent to the home village where the family pundit cast a horoscope, and the two don't match in the slightest particular. So maybe it was a time difference or whatever that happened, but the result was when I was getting married for the first time and my wife's family wanted horoscope, and the first one we gave, here's another one. If this works, you can have this one instead. So in many ways, my life has been a story of two narratives, the pursuit of two destinies at the same time. One was, my work in international affairs and in public life, in the UN first, then in politics, all of that. The other has been my life as a writer, somebody who reacts to the world he sees around him through words and ideas. And in some ways, in India today, the two have come close together, and one might say they each undermine and each overlap and each reinforce the other. So it's a peculiar situation. That could well be perhaps one theme of such a book. But as I said earlier, I'm in no hurry to write one. Give me time to live a little more before I write about living.
Okay. There's a gentleman near the camera with his left arm raised, wearing a suit and tie. By the camera. Thank you. Yes, sir. Please keep the questions short.
In 1942, the first Governor General, Rajaji Rajgopalacharya, has written in his jail diary that my time people, after 50 years of independent India, will regret and will say that British rule was better, because he could see the greed and the corruption of whatever was in the Congress party that time and the result which we are facing. So it is not that time BJP was not there, Jansankhya was not there. It was the Congress.
Is this a question?
Yeah, this is a question. So why today we
What's the
blame
question, please?
Question is why we keep blaming BJP when Rajaji Rajgopalacharya, who refused to become a president of India,
Thank you.
he has written in 1942.
So Rajaji, Lord Wavell, who was the second last Viceroy of India, wrote in his diary, which I have read, that Rajaji, or Rajgopalacharya as he called him, was more Tory than the staunchest British conservative. And that expression, you know, a Tory is somebody who's very right of centre on many aspects, economics, social, and so on. Rajaji was a man of great integrity. I'm an admirer of his. I was a strong supporter of the Swatantra Party in my college days, which he founded. So don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing Rajagopalachari, but he was writing from a particular political perspective. The sad truth is, unfortunately, no particular party has a monopoly on corruption in this country. And I'm afraid we could tell you a few stories about the party you admire and the money they've made.
Thank you. A young man right at the front here with glasses. If you could pass the mic to him. Thank you. Please keep it short, sir.
Sir, you said that chanting Bharat Mata Ki Jai does not determine somebody's patriotic nature. So similarly, if someone refuses to chant Bharat Mata Ki Jai, that does not also determine his or her patriotic nature. So, sir, similarly, if refusing to wear a black skulled cap, how can it determine that somebody is biased towards a particular religion?
No, you're quite right. I think that there should be no acid tests. That was the great strength of India. I've often said that, you know, ultimately patriotism is love of your own country. And the famous British poet, reads there a man with soul so dead, who never to himself has said, this is my own, my native land. That's the basic feeling that most people have about the country they belong to. But the ways in which you express it should depend on each individual. It should be the right of that individual as to how they express their patriotism. And if some of our Muslim friends feel that they can say Jai Hind, they can sing Jana Gana Mana, but they won't say Bharat Mata Ki Jai because in their interpretation of their religion, deifying the country as a goddess is against their faith, why should you not respect their right to do that and not do that? I would say the same. For example, in Kerala, we have a tradition. Every function begins with the lighting of a lamp, which of course is an old Hindu practice. But it's carried on by people of all faiths. I've done it in Christian functions. I've done it in secular functions. But some Muslims, not all, maybe not even a majority, would not light the lamp because they say it's against their faith. Fine, that's their privilege. No one is offended by that. We can still share a stage with them. Now, you ask about wearing a skull cap or not wearing a skull cap. I think, you know, the fact is that what occasioned comment about our Prime Minister was that wherever he goes, he wears, at least for photo ops, whatever caps and headgear are given to him. It could be a big, astonishing thing with a dead bird on it in some of our northeastern tribal areas, and he'll wear it. But the only thing he's refused to wear, the only thing he's actually put a hand and stopped and turned away, has been a Muslim skull cap. So that sends a certain signal, that's all. But I agree with you, it doesn't make Mr. Modi any less patriotic. It just makes it clear there's one thing that he won't wear, and you can draw your own conclusions from that.
Thank you. We've got time for one last question. There's a young man by one of the cameras wearing a blue jumper with his right hand raised. He's been trying for a very long time to ask a question. Just please keep it short. Yeah, that guy. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, you are a member of a political party also. So please tell us, does this help you to express yourself better or restrict you to express?
There are obvious restrictions. First of all, on many issues of debate, there is a party position. And if you disagree with the party position, your choices are invidious. You either disagree, in which case you fall out with your party and perhaps damage the party you believe is the best vehicle for larger issues in life, or you shut up, in which case your free speech has been restricted. So there are restraints on serving politicians in public life, which would not affect public intellectuals who are just doing their own thing. But there are always other sanctions too. A public intellectual who repeatedly criticizes this government is quite likely to face other kinds of retribution in today's India. That is, sadly, the climate we're in. I'll leave it there because I think there's time for one more question if I'll answer it quickly.
This young lady right at the front, please keep it short because we're nearly out of time.
So firstly, I'd like to thank you for the wonderful talk. And also, so you said that you don't need to agree on everything for a successful democracy, except for the ground rules. However, I just wanted to ask, Indira Gandhi's 42nd Amendment to the Constitution, wasn't that the very definition of discourse regarding the ground rules?
Yeah, so I frankly was not a fan of the emergency. I mean, the good thing about me is you can always catch me out because I have a very long paper trail. I've been published in this country since my school days. I have magazines, articles, and books. So you know that what I'm saying can be checked against my own words. I was a critic of the emergency. I thought it was a bad idea. And I really disliked the Congress Party for doing it. And I've been a critic of the Congress Party on numerous occasions, including the emergency and the 84 Sikh riots and so on, where I felt the party could have done better. However, as I said when I fought my first election in 2009, and people pointed to my writings, I said, I'm fighting the election of 2009, not the election of 1977. Now, coming back to your specific concern about the 42nd Amendment, as you know, the critics of the emergency won the next election. And they had an opportunity to undo most of the things in the 42nd Amendment that they didn't like. The fact that they still left some things in there shows that there was a consensus on some of the ideas she put into the 42nd Amendment, but there wasn't a consensus on others, and those got struck down. So the good thing about democracy within our ground rules is that it is self-correcting. You make mistakes in democracy, but you have the capacity, as long as you remain democratic, of correcting your mistakes. If you look at this particular example, there is absolutely no doubt that had the emergency kind of regime continued, there wouldn't have been an opportunity to correct it. But the ground rules were there. The emergency was constitutional. It was actually legal. Today, you cannot have an emergency on those grounds because that's been struck down. That's been taken out of the Constitution. So as long as you stick by the rules, and when I was answering that earlier question, I wasn't just referring to the literal ground rules of the Constitution, but also the spirit of the Constitution, the spirit and values of our democracy. Those also have to be honored, and there's a way in which things have been done for many years that's no longer being done that way. That's the point.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we are now out of time. I would just like to thank Shashi Tharoor and
she's asking, do I consider myself more a politician or an author? The truth is that politics deals with the now, and I hope that writing deals with something long. I'm already a former minister. One day I'll be a former MP, but I hope never to be a former writer.
ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Let's give Shashi Tharoor one more round of applause. Thanks also go to Michael Dwyer for facilitating the session and to Outlook for presenting the session. And Shashi Tharoor will be signing books, so you can purchase his books at the JCB Prize for Literature bookshop managed by Full Circle. It's located next to the Charbagh venue on the left-hand side. All the books are available there, and Shashi Tharoor will appear here at the Nexa front lawn in the Z kiosk to sign your books. That Z kiosk is located in the far right corner of the Nexa front lawn. So please do go ahead and buy Shashi Tharoor's books. He'll be happy to sign for you at the Z kiosk. The next session here at the Nexa front lawn at 3:45 is The Unravelling, with Rakshanda Jalil, Harsh Mander, Pavan K. Varma, and Abhinav Chandrachud, that will be moderated by Mihir Sharma and presented by the Rajasthan Patrika